The paramedics were gone by 9:40 that morning, and by 10, I was alone in a house I'd shared with my wife for 41 years, standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at the exact spot on the linoleum where she'd collapsed while watering her tomato plants, gone before I even got to her. An aneurysm, the coroner later told me. No warning, no history, nothing either of us could have seen coming. I didn't cry that first day. I did something else instead, something I'd later understand was its own kind of emergency. I walked into the garage and started tearing out the kitchen cabinets she'd asked me to replace for 3 years running, at 9 o'clock that same night, alone, in a house that still smelled like her. If you're new to this channel, subscribe, because I tell the real, unpolished version of these stories every week. My name is John Mitchell. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 40 years as an iron worker and eventually a construction foreman in Cleveland, Ohio, running crews on commercial builds, 2 hospital wings, a stretch of the interstate overpass system, more concrete and steel than I could ever fully account for. My wife Diane taught piano lessons out of our home for over 30 years, and between my construction hours and her students filing through our living room most afternoons, our house was rarely quiet, rarely still, which made the silence after she died feel less like an absence and more like an assault, something the house was actively doing to me every single hour I sat in it. We married in 1984, both 26 years old, and raised 2 kids, Beth and Mark, in that same house on the west side of Cleveland, a modest colonial I'd done half the renovations on myself over the decades, using the same hands I used every day on job sites to slowly improve the one place that was actually ours. Diane used to joke that she married a man who couldn't sit still if his life depended on it. And for 41 years, that restlessness had mostly served us well. A finished basement, a rebuilt porch, a garden shed I'd built the summer Mark left for college. It never once occurred to either of us that the same restlessness would eventually become something closer to a problem than a gift. I want to be honest about what those first 4 months actually looked like, because I don't think enough people talk plainly about this particular pattern, the version of grief that doesn't look like grief at all from the outside, that looks instead like remarkable resilience, a man staying productive, staying busy, apparently coping well. I didn't fall apart. I built things. I retiled the bathroom Diane had mentioned wanting updated. I rebuilt the back deck from scratch, a project that should have taken 2 weekends and instead took me 6, because I kept tearing sections back out and redoing them, never quite satisfied, never quite finished, working past midnight most nights under a shop light clamped to the fence, sawdust and sweat at 68 years old in the dead of an Ohio winter. I repainted the garage twice in the same color. I reorganized my tool bench 3 separate times in a single month, each reorganization taking a full weekend, as if the correct arrangement of wrenches might somehow resolve something that had nothing whatsoever to do with wrenches. My daughter Beth, who lives 20 minutes away, started stopping by unannounced, and I could see the concern on her face every single time. Though neither of us said much about it directly for a long while, her eyes moving to whatever half-finished project currently occupied the garage, then back to me, then away. A pattern I recognized but wasn't ready to name out loud. My son Mark flew in from Chicago for what I thought was a regular visit in month 4, and instead found me in the garage at 1:30 in the morning, tearing apart a set of shelving I'd built myself less than 2 years earlier for no reason I could actually articulate when he asked. He'd apparently gotten a call from Beth earlier that week, the 2 of them comparing notes about their father's steadily accumulating pile of unnecessary projects, and had booked a flight without telling me the real reason for the visit. He didn't yell. He just stood in the doorway in his travel clothes, jet-lagged, watching me work at an hour most 34-year-olds would be asleep, and asked me, quietly, how much sleep I'd actually gotten that week. When I couldn't give him a real answer, more specifically, when I realized I genuinely didn't know the last time I'd slept more than 4 hours in a stretch. He sat down on an overturned bucket and told me something that landed harder than I expected. He said, "Dad, you've spent 40 years building things so you wouldn't have to sit still with anything hard. Mom's death is the one thing you can't outbuild." I didn't have a response to that. I just kept sanding the shelf edge I'd already sanded twice, and Mark let me. Sitting there in silence with me until almost 3 a.m, which in hindsight was probably the actual intervention, not the words themselves. I started seeing a grief counselor at Beth's insistence, a reasonable, practical woman named Dr. Halloran, who within our second session named the pattern almost exactly the way Mark had told me that constant. Frantic physical labor can function as a genuine avoidance mechanism, the mind staying so occupied with measurements and cuts and deadlines that it never has to sit still long enough to actually feel the loss underneath it. I pushed back on that initially, told her building things was just who I was. 40 years of a trade doesn't disappear because your wife died. She didn't argue the point directly. She just asked me one question that stuck with me for weeks afterward. Was I building because I loved the work, or because I was afraid of what would happen the moment I stopped? I sat with that question through 4 more sessions without a real answer. And Dr. Halloran, to her credit, never pushed me to manufacture one before I was ready. She simply kept circling back to it, gently, session after session, the way you'd tap the same weak spot on a wall to see if it eventually gives. I didn't have a real answer to that question for almost 2 months, and it was Beth, of all people, who eventually pointed me toward something like one. She'd been researching retirement destinations for herself and her husband, years down the road, and mentioned almost in passing over Sunday dinner that Oaxaca, Mexico kept coming up in every serious article as the country's artisan capital. A city built around woodcarvers, weavers, and craftsmen who approached their work with a patience and intentionality that seemed, from what she read, like the specific opposite of the frantic 2 a.m. Sanding sessions she'd been quietly worried about for months. She showed me photos on her phone that same evening, brightly painted wooden animals from a village called San Martin Tilcajete. And I remember feeling an odd, immediate pull toward them. Less about the destination itself, and more about the sheer patience the work clearly demanded. A patience I recognized I didn't currently have and, somewhere underneath the resistance, badly wanted. I want to comment down below and ask, honestly, whether you've ever caught yourself using busyness the same way I was, staying in motion specifically to avoid sitting still with something painful. I flew down for a scouting trip that spring, stayed 9 days, and spent most of them simply walking Oaxaca's historic center, the Scalo, the Santo Domingo Church rising over the Jalitlaco neighborhood, markets thick with the smell of mole simmering in enormous clay pots since before dawn. I ate slower than I had in months, sat through entire meals without checking a phone or mentally planning the next task, and found myself, on day 3, genuinely startled to realize an hour had passed while I simply watched a weaver work a loom in a small shop off the Zecalo. No restlessness, no urge to fill the silence with motion. On day 5, a guide I'd hired for a single afternoon took me out to a small village called San Martin Tilcajete, about 30 minutes outside the city, one of the traditional centers for a specific Oaxacan craft called alebrijes. brightly painted wooden figures carved from copal wood, each one taking weeks of patient, unhurried work from a single block. I stood in a workshop watching a craftsman named Don Aurelio work a chisel through a piece of copal with a slowness that, as a man who'd spent 40 years building things fast, under deadline, under pressure, I found almost physically uncomfortable to witness at first. I moved to Oaxaca permanently that September, 11 months after Diane died, into a small rented house in the Halitlaco neighborhood, close enough to walk into the historic center most mornings. I started twice weekly Spanish lessons my first month with a young teacher named Fernanda, and I'll admit those early sessions tested a patience I was still very much learning, my 68-year-old brain fighting for every verb conjugation the same way my hands would soon fight against a chisel. I returned to San Martin Tilcahede within my first 2 weeks, found Don Aurelio's workshop again, and asked him, in the limited Spanish I'd been cramming for months, whether he'd take on an old American builder as some kind of student. He looked at my hands for a long moment, the specific calluses 40 years of construction work leaves behind, turned them over once as if reading a set of blueprints, and told me, through my guide's translation that first visit, that hands like mine already knew hard work. What they needed to learn was patience, an entirely different skill. The first piece Don Aurelio had me attempt, a simple armadillo, took me 6 weeks to complete, working 2 mornings a week under his direction, and I want to be honest that the process nearly broke my patience entirely more than once. Every instinct built over 40 years of construction pushed me toward speed, toward finishing, toward the next task, and Don Aurelio would simply take the chisel from my hand whenever he saw me rushing, set it down, and make me sit with the unfinished piece for a full 5 minutes before letting me continue, forcing a stillness on me that felt, that first month, almost unbearable. I remember one particular Tuesday, maybe my 3rd week, when I actually stood up and walked out of the workshop entirely, frustrated past the point of politeness, and stood outside in the courtyard for a solid 20 minutes before Don Aurelio's granddaughter, a teenager named Itzel, who helped translate on the days my guide wasn't available, came out and simply sat beside me on the low wall without saying anything at all. The exact same silent patience her grandfather practiced, apparently a family trait. He told me once, through Itzel's translation, that copal wood tells you when it's ready to be cut, and that rushing it doesn't produce a faster armadillo, just a broken one. A sentence I've thought about more times than I can count in the months since. Something shifted around week 5. I don't have a cleaner way to describe it than that. I was sitting with an unfinished section of the armadillo's shell, following Don Aurelio's forced pause, watching the afternoon light move slowly across the workshop's dirt floor, and instead of the usual restlessness, I felt something closer to what Dr. Halloran had been gently pushing me toward for months, actually sitting with an unfinished, imperfect thing, instead of immediately needing to fix it. I thought about Diane's tomato plants that morning, still unwatered when the ambulance left, the specific detail that had haunted me more than almost anything else in the months since. And for the first time since the funeral, I let myself simply feel the size of that loss instead of grabbing a tool to redirect the feeling somewhere else. I cried in that workshop, an old iron worker in a village outside Oaxaca, ugly, racking sobs I hadn't let myself have even at the funeral itself, where 40 years of construction site stoicism had kept my face carefully arranged for the sake of Beth and Mark. Don Aurelio didn't say a word, didn't offer a tissue or a platitude, just kept working quietly a few feet away, letting me have it. The same unhurried patience he brought to every piece of copal wood that passed through his hands. I finished that armadillo 3 weeks later. Imperfect. One leg slightly shorter than the others. And Don Aurelio told me, with what I've come to recognize as his highest form of praise, that it looked like it had been made by someone who'd actually lived something. I've made 11 pieces since then over the past several months, each one slower than the last. Each one less about finishing, and more about the specific hours spent in that workshop. Hands moving at a pace 40 years of deadlines never once allowed them. I've come to know the wider community of carvers in San Martin Tilcahede, beyond just Don Aurelio's workshop. A tight network of maybe a dozen families who've practiced this specific craft for generations, several of whom now recognize me by name when I walk through the village on my twice-weekly visits. Don Aurelio's neighbor, a woodcarver named Rogelio, invited me to help paint a finished piece for the first time about 4 months in, an intricate owl covered in the small, deliberate dots traditional to the region, a task that required a steadiness I genuinely hadn't developed yet, and forced me back into that same uncomfortable, necessary patience all over again. I've been invited twice now to family meals in the village, plates of mole and fresh tortillas passed around a table, where I understand maybe 60% of the conversation, and have come to find the remaining 40% strangely peaceful rather than isolating. A kind of comfortable not quite belonging that 40 years in Cleveland construction crews never once prepared me to appreciate. Mark visited in the spring, found me in that same Tilcahede workshop instead of a garage at 2 a.m, and watched me work a piece for almost an hour without saying much, the same way he'd sat with me on that overturned bucket back in Cleveland. This time on a real chair Don Aurelio pulled out for him, rather than an upended paint bucket. Near the end of that visit, holding the small owl I'd been working on for 3 weeks, he said, "This is different than the shelves, Dad." I told him he was right, that the shelves had been about escaping something, and this, somehow, slower, less finished, less controlled, had become about actually staying with it. I still talk to Dr. Halloran occasionally, video calls now that I'm down here, and she asked me recently, almost a year into this whole process, whether I still felt the old pull toward frantic, sleepless building whenever grief resurfaced unexpectedly. I told her honestly that I do, some weeks more than others. A Tuesday last month, when a song Diane used to hum around the house came on in a cafe, and I found my hands itching for a chisel before I'd even finished my coffee. The difference now isn't that the instinct disappeared. It's that I recognize it the moment it arrives. The way 40 years on job sites taught me to recognize the specific groan a structure makes right before something gives way. And I've learned to sit with that recognition for a few minutes before deciding what to actually do with it. Exactly the discipline Don Aurelio built into me, one forced 5-minute pause at a time. She told me that's very likely as close to fully healed as grief this size ever actually gets. Not an absence of the old pattern, but a genuine choice available in the moment the pattern shows up, which struck me as about the most honest thing anyone's told me since Diane died. I keep the armadillo, that first imperfect piece, with the slightly shorter leg, on the windowsill of my kitchen here in Oaxaca, the first thing I see most mornings with my coffee. Diane never got to see Mexico, never got to sit in that workshop or taste Rogelio's wife's mole, or hear Itzel's careful, patient English. I think about that specific absence often, the version of this life she'll never know about. And I've stopped treating that particular grief as something to build my way past. But I think, more than any deck I ever rebuilt or shelf I ever reorganized in those frantic first months, that armadillo is the truest thing I've made since she died. Slow, imperfect, and entirely honest about exactly what it cost to finish it, The same way, I suspect, any real thing worth making usually is. If there's one thing I'd want another widower watching this to take from my own particular version of that first year, it's simply this. Notice what your hands are actually doing while you grieve. Because mine, for a good long while, were telling me something I badly needed a chisel and a patient old man in a small Mexican village to finally help me hear. I'm John Mitchell. Thank you for listening to Retired in Mexico.